Welcome back, everyone. We're going to get started with our second panel, Scaling Your DAO. Our session moderator will be Larry Sukernick. Larry is the co-founder of Reverie, a firm focused on helping DAOs grow. Prior to Reverie, Larry led investments at Digital Currency Group. All right, Larry, over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. So I'm really excited about this panel. I feel like most DAO sessions are a bit theoretical, and here we have an opportunity to really get super tactical with discussing scaling DAOs. But I guess just to start, could all the panelists give a quick introduction to themselves, Zach, Aaron, and Frog Monkey? It'd be great to get the listeners to hear what you're building.
Sure. Hey, everybody, my name is Zach. I'm the co-founder of Quadratic, and Quadratic is a platform to help DAOs compensate each other. So it's essentially a decentralized compensation platform where contributors themselves can pay each other. And before that, I was also a co-founder of a consultancy called Converge at converge.net.
Nice. I am the founder of a company called The Ready that helps organizations, DAOs, and traditional organizations avoid bureaucracy and do some very interesting decentralized operations. And I'm also building a software company called Murmur, which is essentially the decision infrastructure for the new economy. So ways to make decisions that are not votes on chain.
Hey, my name is Frog. I currently at Worker Protocol, which is a sort of on-chain governance tool, working there on sort of content and biz dev. But before that, I was at Bankless DAO for about 8 months. Kind of did a lot there to take Bankless DAO from 0 to 1. So definitely have a lot of perspectives on scaling DAOs, and very happy to be here.
Great, thanks for that, guys. And just to the audience, I'll mention we were supposed to have the co-founder of Worker Protocol, Julia, on, but unfortunately she got some food poisoning. So Frog was generous enough to hop on last minute and rep for Workup. So I guess, guys, just to dive right in, the topic is called scaling DAOs. And when I Google scaling, it says something to the effect of, growing scales, like slowly having scales form over your body. And obviously, when we're talking about DAOs, that's not the case. But practically speaking, when you hear scaling, and in terms of scaling a DAO, what does that mean to you? And maybe, Aaron, you could go first here.
Well, I mean, I think the obvious thing to think about right out of the gate is membership scale, but that's only one dimension of it. But that's the one I spend the most time on because it causes the most problems. So as the number of people contributing, participating, collaborating goes up, all the challenges around operations and governance go up too. So that's definitely one way. And then I think the other way is really more about impact or reach. So what does it look like in terms of who you're touching, how you're working in the ecosystem, and you might have 10 billion people playing with something that's run by 2 folks.
And Zach, I'd love to hear from you too. One thing that's cool about Coordinate is it really did start with the YFI community. And so you've seen firsthand how DeFi DAOs scale. How do you think about scale when applied to DAOs?
I mean, maybe the same for any kind of human system, but scaling for what, I think, is one, is the first place to start. What is the DAO's purpose? And based on that, how does it need to scale? I think the other thing that's important to think about for DAOs is that, you'll hear us at some point in this panel talk about vibes and how vibes are really important within DAOs. And so, maybe also similar to companies, but how much can you scale while keeping a certain culture, while keeping certain processes, shared context in place? And so when you think about scaling, it's sort of more dictated by how can you scale kind of out, not up? So how many of those groups can you keep strong vibes together with as you think about scaling?
Yeah, I'll echo what Zach said about scaling out, not up. To me, I think scale is like a function of speed of functional membership. And by that, I mean, if you have new members joining your DAO, how quickly can they go from being a new entrant to actually actively contributing in a meaningful way? Which I think is like a very difficult transition to make in DAOs because there's a lot of shared context that DAOs have that new members don't. And so to me, scaling DAOs just means having the right infrastructure in place such that when new members join your DAO, they can quickly gain that shared context, understand sort of the organizational Legos of that DAO itself, and know where to plug in and how to sort of start contributing in meaningful ways.
So I'm glad everyone is talking about when it comes to scaling, just like, the people org, and vibes was mentioned. I guess, I imagine a lot of listeners are not super DAO native, and to them, they hear DAOs and they have a conceptual understanding. Okay, well, it's a group of people working together to accomplish some task. But I think practically, a lot of people are kind of lost on what it means to join a DAO, right? What does it mean to be a contributor or a DAO member? Could you guys talk about what it means to be a DAO, what sort of DAOs there are, how to even join a DAO, and the different types of onboarding processes you've seen? I think that would make it a little bit more tangible for the audience.
I would defer to Frog for the first take at this answer, having managed all different kinds of on-ramps into Bankless.
Yeah, so the question is, what does it mean to sort of be a DAO contributor, and what are the pathways to sort of get there across sort of the DAO ecosystem? I think like the question about like what does it mean to be a DAO contributor is, as with all things, fairly amorphous and ambiguous. In some more like concrete measurements, you'll see people or some DAOs create like these membership criteria, right? So they'll say, hey, you need to hold a certain amount of tokens in order to be considered a full DAO member. So friends and benefits is an example. You need to have like 75 friends and benefit tokens in order to sort of be privy to their internal sort of community, right? Other sort of like measurements of DAO contributors is more based on the social reputation of your contributions to the broader community. I think like Coordinate has this function where you could basically vouch for adding a new member into that Coordinate circle. You can think of, I don't want to speak too much about Coordinate since we have Zach here, but you can think of Coordinate circles as like these, the sort of in-group for sort of individual like working groups within a DAO. And so in that sense, your membership is more based on, do other members of your community identify you as a contributor? And so it's more of like this social network than it is a hard and fast criteria. Some more advanced DAOs will have like multiple membership requirements. So maybe to have a certain amount of like reputation as measured by your contributions within the DAO in combination with perhaps an NFT that represents some voting or governance power, or in combination with like maybe even some tokens, so that you have some sort of stake in the game. And so the term, like the DAO member contributor term, I think is like highly dependent on the sort of like culture of the DAO itself and what that DAO is trying to accomplish, and how technical that DAO is as well. As for like sort of onboarding and sort of that DAO membership funnel, I think like DAOs don't have a traditional sort of like HR or sort of human operations function, right? I think some DAOs definitely do, but others, it is a pretty messy path in order to become a DAO contributor. Sometimes like you just kind of get thrown into a Discord or Telegram channel, and you need to like sort of hunt and gather for various contexts, whether that's like reading old blog posts or asking questions to people, reading Notion pages, wikis, all that stuff. Whereas like other DAOs will definitely have a clear contribution pipeline where they'll have onboarding documentation. They might have new joiner sessions where you can actually go and talk to people. I don't know if I want to talk too much about this, but like I have some like pretty strong opinions on what qualifies a good contributor pipeline. But you'll note that a lot of the best onboarding processes are very human-centric and not purely reliant on either automation or reading text or listening to videos. So just a few thoughts there.
I would underline everything Frog just said, and for people thinking about kind of fundamentally what's the difference between a DAO and a company, I think a mental model of a company is like a pyramid kind of structure where you kind of come in at the bottom and work your way up to a smaller and smaller group. Because I think of DAOs as more like a sphere sort of shape where people can enter in from any of the various places. You can wander into a Discord chat and start asking questions and get involved, and you sort of make your way a journey toward the center where there's presumably more involvement, more compensation, more decision rights, etc. But really what's fundamentally different to me, there's a couple things, but an important one in this context is that there aren't gatekeepers in the same way. And that normally when I go to a job, I'm going to interview and try to impress them about what I'm going to do. And then I get hired to do that. Whereas a DAO, I come and say like, hey, I made this, is this helpful? Hey, I like what you're doing. How can I help? Here's a way I can help, and take that step first to find your way in, as opposed to an interview. Go ahead, Aaron.
Oh no, I'm just building because I like what I'm hearing. And I think the clarification, like the macro pattern that we're seeing across all of this, is the atomization of everything. So just like a singular role in a traditional corporation is really being atomized into multiple roles that a person can hold either in one or multiple organizations, so too is the idea of like a permissioned boundary as a singular thing. You're either in or you out. You work at Office Depot or you don't work at Office Depot is also getting atomized into, I think, in a healthy DAO, different layers of access. And it reminds me that like one of the big messages that we've been pushing with DAOs is you can't have a completely wall-to-wall permissionless system and have a successful commons. And in fact, Eleanor Ostrom's like Nobel Prize winning work on commons, the first rule is that you need to have boundaries in a commons. So I think like it's just more of them and more gradations of them and more ways in and ways out than what we're used to seeing. So everything is more nuanced.
Yeah, just riffing on what everyone said, it seems like, to the pessimistic observer, where DAO communities are inventing all these new terms, right? And it may seem like people are just kind of having fun and vibing, when in reality, to your point, Aaron, we are kind of atomizing the organization, right? Where in a traditional company, people are sort of used to the concept of a full-time employee, a contractor, an advisor, a social club member, right? These are very clearly segmented roles that people hold within organizations. For DAOs, I think as a community, we're figuring out what those roles are. We haven't figured out all of them and mapped them out, but slowly and surely we're figuring them out. And I guess this is a good time for us to dive into, incentivizing these people to be part of these organizations. I mean, in the traditional company, people work for money, stock and cash. How do you guys think about incentivizing DAO contributors who hold all sorts of fuzzy roles in the organization? And maybe, Zach, you can start here.
Sure. Because it's ultimately sort of to say it's stock and cash. It's just the mechanisms are a little bit different. So yeah, the way that we sort of have approached this is recognizing that in these really fluid roles where there's a lot of nuance as to what people are contributing in DAOs, and people are contributing all sorts of things, whether that's, hey, I came and translated all of your documentation into French, and someone else might have made 10 memes to send out for your Twitter account, and someone else has started doing some PRs on GitHub, etc. And how do you value these very apples to oranges comparison? And so like Coordinate's answer to that was turn the decision making back to the community. And essentially the way that Coordinate works is everyone in a circle gets some tokens and they distribute them to other people in the circle. And then whatever percentage of those tokens you get as distributed by all your peers, you get some budget that's been allocated to that circle, right? So if a circle has $10,000 attributed to it and everyone sends all their tokens around and I end up with 10% of that, I get $1,000 payout at the end. And so the idea around incentivization there is if you can complete that sort of sense-making loop, is it becomes a shared display for the organization to look and sort of understand, like, what is it that we value? And is what we're paying people to do actually in line with what we need and what we value? And then, there can be multiple sort of circles, as again, you have one for the wider community where everyone is in and sort of anyone can come in and start doing stuff and potentially get incentivized or compensated for it right away. And then there can be other circles with different sort of rules and different sorts of members, again, as you get closer to that concentric center where people maybe are just doing full-time work at one protocol. And we compensate people with a mixture of stable coins and tokens. I think that's fairly common at this point. There's lots of different ways to do that. And there's a bit of a can of worms here, but essentially tokens are, it's useful to think of them in the same way you might think about stock, as actual ownership in the company, actual governance rights, an ability to make decisions about how things work around here.
We had a short prep call for all the panelists here, maybe a few weeks ago. And Aaron, you brought up an interesting point, if I recall correctly, which is, there's different types of incentive alignment methods, right? There's obviously money, cash, tokens, stock, and there's other things, right? Some people work for power, some people work for fame, some people work for other reasons. But can you kind of talk about, based on your experience, other than cash and stock, what are ways DAOs and maybe organizations in general can incentivize talent over the long term?
Totally. I mean, those are good ways to keep things fair. But yeah, I think motivation and incentivization in general is a really messy topic that most of the traditional world gets completely wrong. There's very little that you can do to actually incentivize or motivate someone to do something that they're not already inclined to do in some way, shape, or form. Or if you do, it perverts the long-term outcomes. So you can pay someone to do something, and then as soon as you stop, they won't do it even at the level they were doing it before you started paying for it. But I always go to the like Deci and Ryan self-determination theory, which became the work that was in Dan Pink's book Drive. And basically it just said, essentially motivation for people is about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So autonomy meaning I have the freedom to do what I want, how I want, et cetera, within the bounds of a social system. DAOs get a big check mark there if they're run correctly. Mastery is I feel that I am growing in my skills, I'm learning. And again, I think if you're in the right combination of roles in the right DAO environments, you're drinking from a learning fire hose. So there's a lot to like there. And then purpose, which is, what is my impact and meaning on the world or the community that I'm a part of? And obviously there are a lot of different flavors of what people find motivating on the purpose front. But those are the things I think about in addition to the remuneration for effort and stake in outcomes as being the levers to pull. And I think having really good agreements and cultural norms around each of those things helps a lot.
I'll plus one what Aaron said, just from experience. Like so at Bankless DAO, we would do these monthly community surveys, and one of the had like open-ended questions and stuff, and how you can basically create a code block of all of the most recurring words, and the recurring word that was always at the top of that list is opportunity. And I think DAOs do a fantastic. I think a DAO that is organized well and has the right supporting building blocks in place do provide a foundation for anyone to come in with an idea and do something with that idea, as long as it fits within certain criteria. And so like the permissionless nature by which you can go and execute on something is just so open-ended and broad that people come in with like all these different ideas, and there's just so much like opportunity to mix and match, find people that are interested in the same ideas that you are, gain traction, gain excitement around something, and then just be able to go and execute it. Whereas like in a traditional corporate environment, you're sort of beholden to whatever your boss says, like, hey, that's a great idea, we don't have the resources for it, that's not important, whatever. And it's a much more sort of closed, permissioned environment.
For anyone who's worked at a large company with hundreds of thousands of employees, you probably have gone through a process where you see the sort of things that organization is doing, and a lot of it just doesn't make sense, right? Like there's a clear lack of focus that's visible to a lot of employees. And as a result, they over time get a little bit jaded. It's like, what are we actually doing here? Is it going to move the needle? DAOs sort of have the same issue, right? Like we can incentivize people and people can be have the autonomy to say, hey, I have a really good idea, right? I want some money for it. Please have a vote me in to get some money from the DAO. But often those ideas are, they're not a high priority for the DAO to solve. So how do you guys think about focus and in the context of DAOs? How should DAOs decide what people should be incentivized to work on? Is there some sort of command and control structure? Pods, Orca's product prop pods obviously creates some sort of organizational structure for the DAO, but there's other competing products in the market that are probably taking it from a more bottoms-up approach. But curious how you guys think about the concept of figuring out what to incentivize and what to work on.
Yeah, so this is I think this is generally a challenge within DAOs because DAOs don't have, in theory, DAOs don't have a sort of command and control leadership model, right? And those types of models are typically responsible for creating alignment for the entire DAO, right? When you don't have that type of command and control structure, you're more reliant on sort of community conversation, right, to actually identify what are the biggest priorities within that DAO. The easiest way to do that is by sort of creating your mission, vision, values, right? And that is kind of the anchor point at which a DAO will continue to sort of reflect back on and use that as sort of a litmus test for whether or not a new idea falls within sort of the scope of that DAO. But another thing that I think DAOs should do, and some do well, some don't do well, is holding just these like basically open forums, right, within the community of like, where does this DAO need to go and what are the most important priorities? Because like, again, a DAO is a community-owned organization, right? And so like consistently performing these, retros of what has this DAO accomplished in the past 3 months, the past 6 months, what is the next 3 months, next 6 months of like, should be sort of an open and fluid conversation, but the outcomes of those conversations inform what the sort of like executable path of that DAO looks like going forward. So that's more like on the sort of community and culture side. I think like sort of procedurally, it's important to have the right governance mechanisms, and by that I mean the right processes by which people and the community as a whole makes decisions, and the right coordination mechanisms. And by coordination, I mean sort of like these organizational Legos of how does power flow, up and down, or from within to without. And so I think sort of the combination of those two sort of community-oriented and process-oriented, mechanisms usually inform where resources end up getting allocated towards.
My build on that, because I think that's absolutely right, is about, I think, introducing some different language and some different process than what we're used to having in these systems. Clearly, when you do any complex adaptive system, you're dealing with the trade-off between coherence and diversification. So if all the ants in the colony go after one piece of fruit and it was poisoned, that colony's dead. So you don't want that. But by the same token, you don't want to only have 10% of the ants go after that apple. So there's always this dynamic polarity between doing it one right way versus doing it in a completely chaotic or mathematically random way. And so what we like to do, I think the practice that we implement often is getting either the core contributors or even everyone, depending on the size of the group, together on a regular basis to prioritize what we call even overs. So we're going to prioritize this good thing even over this other good thing, which is very principle level strategy. It's not specific to like, we're going to ship this exact feature. It is, we're going to generally prioritize, market share over margin in the next period. And that means if we can do anything to grow our community, we're going to do that, even if it means we make less profit, or we might prioritize a certain kind of customer or market. And the other thing we do is we talk a lot about essential intent, which is a concept that we borrowed from Greg McKeown, who wrote Essentialism. which is basically the difference between that long-term purpose or mission that Frog was talking about, critically important for orientation. The thing we're doing right now is really important, but we often miss the middle, which is like, what is essential that we achieve to sort of realize that purpose or to move in its direction in the next year, in the next 2 years, in the next 3 years, something in that time horizon that you can actually wrap your arms around it. And so even getting a group to align on that and say like, all right, essential intent for the next 2 years is we roughly want to be here. And the even overs that are going to guide us are roughly this even over that and X even over Y. And now when we're reviewing proposals or opportunities, even at the edge, maybe not even at the center or at the level of a whole vote, we have something to like hang it on and compare it to. And if we choose to do something that's off base from that stuff, those are our 10% bets where we're like, we're going to be non-coherent a little bit for the benefit of like, who knows, maybe we'll accidentally invent AWS. So I think that's the way we think about it.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think it's important to also ask like, why is a DAO structure the right structure for whatever the purpose is you're trying to achieve? If you know exactly what you want to do, where you want to go, and what your KPIs are, then having a command and control structure can be like a way better decision, right? Because you have a deliberate process and a deliberate outcome. We want to make this thing and this number go up. Like, great, do it. A DAO is, I guess, like what Aaron said, it's like you're making this trade-off between certainty and innovation, right? A DAO is much better for emergent outcomes, where we say, we want to go in this general direction, but how that happens, we're much more open to innovation and people trying different things. And it's sort of, to me, DAOs are more of like a go slow to go fast mechanism, where it takes more time to sort of feel the stones as you cross the river and decide like, okay, here's the strategy, here's what we're going to do. But once you do, you have everyone on board and everyone really clear with it. And there's a lot more room for innovation at the edges, right? Anyone can try anything, as long as it doesn't demand too many resources. So I think determining why a DAO is the right structure is a really good place to start.
I'm going to say something, and I'm curious to get everyone's reaction. So I'll say many DAOs succeed in spite of their organizational structure, not because of it. Zach, I would love to hear your reaction, and then Aaron and Frog, yours too.
I mean, succeed in spite of their structure. I guess I could get on board with that if it's because one of the things that DAOs do so well are the ones that are successful are able to express a purpose and really send out a bat signal that resonates with people. And if you look at sort of traditional management literature, like get the right people on the bus is always like right up there at the top. And you have the chance, I think it's been my experience working in this DAO space, that you can attract like really passionate talent. You can attract very intrinsically motivated talent and people who are willing to go through the headaches, because this bizarre experiment of distributed decentralized collaboration in service of some purpose is really exciting to them. What the risk reward, I think, of DAOs is huge. It's obviously much harder to pull off in many ways than sort of a traditional organization, but the potential, if you can harness it, is pretty huge. And there's a lot of people who I think feel enough of a dissatisfaction with sort of the status quo in 100 different ways, that this feels like enough of a departure to actually try something different, that it really resonates with a lot of folks. I've been consistently impressed with the level of talent that is excited to work on both Coordinape and all sorts of projects across Web3. Again, for potentially less money, for less like traditional rewards, but for a lot more intrinsic motivation and the autonomy that they have and the ability to actually move things to work on what they want. So yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that we're in the very early stages of sorting out a lot of these processes and structures and best practices or better practices for DAOs. but people are still willing to jam on it because it's new. So yes, we are succeeding in spite of ourselves.
Aaron, Frog, any thoughts?
I would just rephrase it. DAOs are successful in spite of their lack of structure. A DAO is a Goldilocks problem. So you actually need the right amount of skeletal structure for emergence to happen. And finding that point, that minimum viable governance or minimum viable constraint is the game. And I would argue most have not succeeded at that game yet. So they're actually succeeding in spite of that inhibitor, and they could be doing better.
Yeah, my thoughts here, I'll like plus one what Aaron said, that I think the organizational design of DAOs is still quite an emergent space, in that we haven't quite figured out what is sort of the optimal architecture for a DAO. I feel like the DAO ecosystem continues to sort of like converge and learn as a collective unit, but there's still so much left to sort of figure out, and obviously there's going to be like inefficiencies and problems in that. The second thing I'll say is like, not all DAOs need to be DAOs. And I think that's kind of a fallacy that, you know, we have like as an industry sort of leaned into, because that is just like the catchy thing that, you know, that's what the kids are doing nowadays, basically, right? But in reality, like sometimes a hierarchical incorporated model with a CEO works best, and it's okay to admit that, because like you have to do what's best for your organization and for your customers and for your users and for your community. That being said, like I think that there are quite a few DAOs that have continued to be quite successful if you define their success by their mission, right? I think if you define success purely from sort of a monetary perspective, like is this DAO using their funds in the most efficient manner, then I don't know, probably not, right? But if you measure a DAO success by like, are they actually able to execute on their mission? I think you'll find that the sort of permissionless nature and the amount of experimentation and the appetite for risk and new ideas all happening in parallel, you end up having like quite a few gems that come out of all these individual projects, that like, again, you know, you might have like 80% failures, but if you have 20% successes, like to me, that's still that still means that you're executing on your mission.
I was last week I was with a few friends. I think there's 5 of us in the group, and we were deciding what to order for dinner, and we were using Uber Eats, and you know, one guy said Chinese, the other guy said Indian, I think I said sushi, and we kept going back and forth, right? We had too many cooks in the kitchen, and eventually someone said, okay, you know, let's just go with American. They had this like whole reasoning for why American is what we're going to order, and so we got burgers. And of course, that's more of a centralized sort of decision. How do you guys think, and Frog, you sort of teased to this, how do you think about which decisions benefit from having more people sitting on the table versus which decisions really benefit from having very few people deciding what is best for the broader group? And maybe Aaron, you can start us off here if you have thoughts.
Oh my God. How many hours do you have? Yeah, the main thing to say about this,
we have half an hour or so.
Yeah, exactly.
So you have that much.
The main thing to say about this is that the vast majority of decisions that are confronting continuous complexity or richness of change in the environment benefit from collective decision making, because you get more sensors on the environment, more inputs from different perspectives. Decisions that are more complicated and less complex, that benefit from expertise or experience, tend to be faster and safe to try at an individual or much smaller level. So we look at it that way. We also look at it through the lens of like type 1, type 2 decisions. So if it's highly irreversible or dangerous or like one-way door, that's going to be better made as a collective, at least a small collective of core contributors or power holders, ideally with everyone. And if it is a two-way door that you can very easily reverse course or change or pivot or iterate, then yeah, that takes a lot of wind out of the sails. And so really you're building a decision stack. The bottom of it is, what can anyone decide without anyone's help? Then what can anyone decide with advice? Then what can roles decide? Then what can roles decide with advice? And finally, what do we need to consent on at a community level or a collective level within our pod, squad, working group, or organization?
Couldn't agree more. don't I mean that the broader it is, the more it helps to get more perspectives. And by the time you narrow down, sort of give people a chance to weigh in and say their piece at different levels. And the more granular it gets, the tighter the decision-making crew. Yeah, and lots of interesting stuff happening in DAOs with different ways to make those decisions. From things like quadratic voting, so tokens give you a chance to weigh in on things, but not directly proportional to how many tokens you have, to awesome tools. I mean, a plug for Murmur, a way to really come to consensus at a broad level, and then implement those and have a shared display. The one other point on this that's just important, I mean, for sort of any group, but especially for DAOs, is that sort of white space is really unhelpful for large groups. And so the asking the DAO, like, what should we do? We always encourage everyone to be like, my current best thinking, make it better. We say this all the time. So it's like, current best thinking, we should do this. This is the plan. Make it better, right? It's always up for debate, or it's always open to improvement, but don't just ask, to the point of going to dinner. Like, don't say, what should we have? Say, I think we should have Chinese. Like, and then people have something to react to. Otherwise, it can be super inefficient.
Switching gears a little bit, I want to talk a little about DAO culture. And culture is this funny, fuzzy topic, I feel like. I mean, if you go to the company culture page of many companies and you read it, and then you work for the company or interview the employees, you get very different things, right? Company cultures are these aspirational things, which are, even for very centralized organizations with command and control structures, hard to really spread. And then here we have DAOs, which are way more loosely coordinated, way more decentralized, typically bottoms up. And culture there is even more difficult to really create. So maybe, Aaron, to start us off, how do you think about culture just in general as a concept, and how DAOs that you've seen think about it?
Well, I think they would say vibes, for starters. I think, like, my favorite quote on this comes from Niels Flagging. He says, culture is like a shadow. And the reason that's really important is it's not something you can directly work on. You can't like fix the culture or work on the culture or make the culture happen. The culture is an emergent property of the actual thing that hits the wall like a shadow. So we always say, work the system, work the agreements, work the norms, work the habits. That's where that stuff is made. And I think when people talk about vibes, that's actually what they're tuning into, is like, what happens when we hold the space this way? What happens when we have a habit or a norm around this kind of joy or this kind of optimism or this way of trusting each other? So to me, yeah, work the system by looking at those social interactions and either encoding what's working to make it last longer at some level, or trying experimental agreements on new things that might move an issue or a tension forward.
I like that a lot. I thought that myself, that culture, vibes is the new term for culture. There's definitely a lot of similarities there. Zach, curious if you have anything to add on that point.
No, I mean, vibes eat strategy for breakfast. It's still it's still the same, vibes and culture. And in that sense, like I feel like it's similar to any traditional org where everything kind of flows out of the original intent, the way of being of the first people there, and what do we do and how do we do it around here, and people pick up on that. And like I was saying earlier, I mean, I think that's a really big differentiator for a lot of DAO projects right now, is the culture they've been able to create. And I'm not sure how much different that is really than any type of human system, where sort of, a good culture kind of is the cure for almost all other ails.
I think like, because the contributor switching cost for a DAO is so low, right? In that if you want to go join another DAO, it's actually not too difficult, right? You just hop into a Discord channel. If they have the right sort of structures in place, like you figure out where you can start contributing, you figure out how you start getting paid for this kind of stuff. And so because that switching cost is so low, like you need to have the right culture in place as a mechanism for creating this like stickiness within your DAO, right? And that informs everything, right? That informs the way you do governance, that informs the way you treat people, that informs the way you structure your meetings, that informs how you do your community calls, right? It's ingrained into like the lifeblood of your DAO. And I always think about that, right? Like if you, to me, because that switching cost is so low, you always have to ask yourself, like, will I say something that will push this person to go to another DAO? Or will I like set up a system that makes this person feel inadequate, or makes them feel unempowered, or makes them, feel like they don't have the autonomy to sort of do what they want to do best. So yeah.
Zach, how do we make vibes good? Easy one for you.
Well, ideally, you get everyone working in the same place for a long, consistent period of time so that they can build interpersonal trust. How do you do it across all sorts of time zones and cultures, and pseudonymous and and anonymous contributors in a Discord and Telegram groups? So I'll say that the things that I've really seen work is, one, is really focusing on that IRL piece. I think that over time, all successful DAOs will have some cadence that's probably 2 times a year where they get together for a real deep dive retreat. This is based on a lot of our learning at Converge, but it's much harder to build trust online, but it's very easy to maintain it. So if you can get people together and establish some baseline interpersonal relationship, then it's much easier to collaborate online. But really doing trust building online is difficult. So I think that most DAOs will get into some cadence of getting their people together. The other thing is just really articulating purpose, as opposed to articulating sort of the benefits of our product. People are coming from all over the place to help work at Coordinate. And they're doing it because we're talking about our vision of a different way of working together. They're not doing it because we're building a decentralized compensation tool for DAOs. I guess this like sort of gets at the Simon Sinek, like start with why, but like why do we actually care about this? What are we about? So, and then being really open about the challenges and kind of open about everything. I think you build really good vibes with vulnerability and transparency and authenticity. And so the more you can show that, hey, we're figuring out as we go, here's our warts, here's what I'm struggling with, here's what the leadership is struggling with. All those just build a much more sort of taking away. I feel like corporate culture to this point has become like so sanitized, right? That it's like people are just desperate to have real conversations. And I think, the best DAOs offer that as well.
Just one quick thing I want to add there too. Sorry, just one quick thing I think is important to add is like you permeate culture by living those cultural values and not just espousing them. And because in a DAO, there are oftentimes no clearly defined leaders. That means that like anyone can actually be a leader. So to me, like the most important thing about like permeating culture is that it's not something that you just talk about, something that you actually have to do, and everyone has to do it, right? Especially those at the top, especially those closest to the center. And sometimes like that's really hard, right? Sometimes that comes at a cost to like, it comes at a major cost to be able to have to live those values, because you're always on. You can't falter. But that's, to me, that's what leadership in a DAO is those who embody the culture the strongest.
I see a good question in the chat, and we're just about to move on to the next topic. So this could be a good time to to get it in the interregnum period. And this question is from Howard Rosenberg, and this one is for all the panelists to think about an answer, but I'll just read it out. So the question is, earlier, one of the speakers questioned the autonomy of DAOs, claiming that they aren't actually autonomous. Do any of you see that autonomy being eventually achieved by the participants and members of the DAO being comprised of bots learning through AI and ML? Investors would then be investing in a bot-run and managed entity, and that's a question mark. And would that be a good thing if it happened? So curious if anyone wants to react to that, because it's an interesting question.
I mean, I would start by answering with again kind of the ultimate dodge. Like, it depends. What is it trying to do? If you want a DAO that's that's trading on some algorithm-based trading, then potentially autonomous AI and machine learning is the way to go. I think that this speaks to me. There's sort of an inflection point right now, where when the first DAO was started, that was more the vision. It's like something run by smart contracts, and really some of the subtext there was kind of like, we can program away these messy humans who keep making everything nuanced and compromised and contradictory, like humans are. And so that DAO nomenclature is stuck, the decentralized autonomous organization, but you can certainly get into all sorts of conversations on Twitter about the definition of DAOs and what are we really talking about here, and there's 10 other good definitions at this point. But I don't think autonomy is really the goal in terms of the organization itself being autonomous. To me, that word speaks to more the people within it. And how do you give that sort of feeling of autonomy and sovereignty to everyone? But it's really hard for me to imagine, and I think this is the shift that we're seeing, is recognizing that there's no amount of software or code or smart contracts that are going to escape the fundamental kind of messiness of humans when they're involved in something. And so how do we make that sandbox tighter is one question, but the idea of it being fully autonomous, I think, just doesn't make sense when there's people involved.
So two things here. One, when we speak of autonomy, I think there are two definitions of autonomy, right? There's programmatic autonomy, or autonomous, right? Bots, code, programs, software, whatever. And there's autonomy, by which you are basically delegating certain responsibilities to groups of people and empowering them to act without act on their own, right? And I think both have a place in DAOs, right? I always like the mental model that I like is like DAOs are code at the center, humans at the periphery. But if you visualize that as just two concentric circles, right? Your code is in the center circle and the people around it. The complexity of the decision space that you have to worry about, the more complex the decision space, the more you need to, the greater the width of people, right? The more people are involved, right? If it's a very simple decision space, if it's, do I want to invest in this product, like an investment DAO, or do I want to, send a valid transaction to the mempool, like the Ethereum or Bitcoin protocol, which I would also consider DAOs. The decision space is so simple that it's mostly autonomous, right? It is mostly code. But then when you start to get to more complex DAOs like Yearn and like Bankless DAO, where you're making decisions around strategy, where you have large communities, where you're thinking about product, you're thinking about resource allocation, you're thinking about partnership, biz dev, whatever. Those are way more complex decisions that you can't rely purely on code to execute. And so you need more people as part of those organizations. The second part of that is like autonomy, right? And I think we touched on this before, where a lot of DAOs start off with like, okay, everyone votes on decisions all the time, right? And as DAOs mature, they begin to delegate some of those decisions further down the stream towards people that have the right context, that have the right information, that have the right, subject expertise within that specific domain, and empowering them to just go and sort of do their own thing. Now, the intersection of those two, I think, is when you create and empower autonomous groups that derive their power and legitimacy from the broader group, right? So sort of this like principal agent relationship, but the terms of those agreements are automatically executed right? So if you create a group that says, hey, we're going to give you the mandate to do all of our marketing, we're going to staff it with, these 3 people on this marketing council, we're going to give you X amount of funds, and this is what we expect of you, right? You are now basically creating this autonomous group saying, hey, these are the mandates, go out and do your thing. The problem with DAOs nowadays is many times those rules are enforced at the social level, right? It's purely on paper when I say that this is the mandate, this is what happens if you don't hit that mandate, these are the consequences, whatever. I think there's a lot of room for us to explore automation in that respect, right? Automation and autonomy in that respect, where you can actually move those sort of rules on chain, right? When you don't complete something, you're able to claw back funds. When you want to remove someone in a position of power, you don't have to rely on them signing a multi-sig transaction to do that. And so I think that is sort of an upcoming space. It's one of the terminologies that you hear a lot is like sub DAOs, basically. So sorry, kind of went off on a tangent there.
No further questions, Your Honor.
That was a really interesting aside, Frog, and maybe worth double clicking. I think we have 9 minutes or so, but we can get through a few more questions. You sort of mentioned how a lot of DAOs are way more programmatic than traditional companies. And in the traditional company, when you enter into an agreement with someone, right, you paper it, right? So you have a legal document, and you're like, okay, well, here are the rules of this engagement. Oh, and by the way, if we break the rules of our engagement, we're going to adjudicate essentially in some sort of court, right? Maybe Delaware courts is something you'll use. And my experience has been, and this is a question for everyone again, many DAOs don't have legal agreements, right? So nothing is papered. It's completely on chain. So there's, programmatic rules that says, hey, I will do this, and in return, I will get paid this. But if disputes arise, typically it is handled on the social layer. So people, get on phones and sort of hash it out without suing each other. But there's also pretty interesting stuff being built like Aragon, right? These digital courts, right? These digital jurisdictions where you don't have to go to governmental courts, but you use these internet native courts. I'm very curious how people here think about that, the concept of a digital court, of a digital dispute resolution mechanism, and how that stuff will play out over the next few years.
I'll take a little bit different tack to it, not so much the digital courts, but thinking about just going a little bit back to the sovereignty, and the autonomous individuals. And you mentioned earlier the absence of HR in DAOs. And again, I think one of the great risk rewards is that I'll speak specifically, in the DAOs that I've been a part of, it is all done on the social layer. And what that requires you to do is develop, stronger muscle in conflict resolution, in giving and receiving feedback, and having critical conversations that you need to have. And in my experience, the teams that can have that and come through it are incredibly more resilient and effective than ones that get into a conflict and outsource it to HR, and say like, I don't want to deal with this. I'm reporting you, or we'll take it up with this mediator, or I'll see you in court, instead of really having to talk through like, what are the different perspectives? We use a conflict resolution process where it essentially, it's if there's a conflict, it's up to 2 people to engage on it. If they can't come to a resolution, they can bring someone in. If that conversation 3 ways doesn't work, you have a panel and you just kind of escalate it until that conflict can be resolved. It can be obviously a little bit messier in some ways. But again, the reward for being able to develop that muscle and do it makes for much more resilient teams, much stronger, again, culture. And so that's what we really advocate at Coordinate as well, because obviously when employees are paying each other, that brings up all sorts of interesting dynamics. And so supporting people and being able to navigate those is a big part of what we do as well.
Zach, do you have that written down anywhere? No.
I think I have it written like in a in a Notion somewhere in our internal documents, but I should probably
Tight.
share that out. At some
No, that's
point.
cool. I'd love to borrow it. We're messing with stuff like that right now, so that's exciting.
Great.
Okay, we have a few more minutes, so maybe a quick rapid fire round of the community questions if I can get through a few of them. Question from John Track. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm very curious about the discussion of the onboarding process for DAOs. Isn't that where you learn what to do to fit in and succeed as a member or stakeholder in the community? So you are excited about the purpose and you know the rules aren't going to screw you over, but then that's your place to experience being included or not. I'm curious if certain DAO tooling companies, like Homeroom or something, and looks like the question ends there. But I guess my read of the question is, the onboarding process for DAOs, it's actually a very topical one, Frog, and for you, Zach. The onboarding process for DAOs, it does seem like some DAOs don't really have the express rules written out, right? It's more of a, hey, I'll become a token holder and I just participate in the forums and the Discord sort of thing. In your experience, how have the successful DAOs handled onboarding? Do they have the clear rules, responsibilities, and perhaps principles available for contributors on the get-go? Or is that something they'll learn over time?
I think it has to be both. For this question, for onboarding in particular, I feel like there's a sort of, for some DAOs, their difficult onboarding is a feature, and for others it's a bug, right? So some people that I know of appreciate sort of the Byzantine, you wander in and it's just like walking into a 300-person party where you don't know anyone. And if you're the kind of person that can strike up a conversation and go strike up this and kind of get involved, then this is the spot for you. This isn't really a place for people who don't have that entrepreneurial streak. There's other DAOs that do an amazing job of sort of buddying you up with somebody right away. And they help you kind of learn the ropes. Where do I find stuff? How do I get involved? Where do I see the different work that needs to be done? And so there's sort of a spectrum there in terms of the kind of throw you in the deep end to a lot of hand-holding and onboarding. And then there's another spectrum of sort of what kinds of contributors is the DAO looking for? I know at more technical DeFi places, they tend to have, a harder time on purpose, sort of setting up a, little bit of a, it's not fair to say, but a little bit of a gauntlet, it's like, hey, if you figured out how to contribute here, that means you're our kind of contributor. Whereas the more social DAOs or things like that are going to want to have a lot more folks. And obviously that comes with a whole raft of problems. If you create this system to say, how do we find more people just like us? Then you end up in an echo chamber. There's all sorts of follow-on issues from there, but that's kind of the two spectrums I would think about it, the onboarding spectrum.
So I haven't been kicked off yet, so maybe we have time for one more question. And I think that'll be our cue to wrap up. So this question comes from Tyler Whittle. And it goes, hey guys, it's Whittle from DAO Masters here. Would love to get your thoughts on finding a viable business model as it relates to scaling. It seems like a lot of DAOs are paying out in native tokens, but have yet to find a sustainable business model. Frog, would be curious about how you thought about this at Bankless, something we're thinking hard about right now. So this one's for you, Frog.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I think protocol DAOs that have a very clear revenue stream have already kind of figured out their business model. But if you're talking specifically about social DAOs, where you basically just have a native token and you're kind of like leaving it up to the community to decide, okay, well, what do you want to do with all this energy, right? How do you want to actually create products and create tools and so on and so forth. To that, I'll say, hey man, it's tough. You basically have to view every single product, every single project, almost like a startup, right? And you have to think about, well, what will this take to become net revenue positive, right? What will this take to actually pay the contributors? And you can subsidize some of that cost by paying any tokens over time. You can subsidize that by paying with native tokens to sort of keep people there, but for time, it needs to have sort of a clear sort of business model to sort of succeed on their own. To that, I'll say, kind of going back to what I was saying about giving teams sort of autonomy, I think it makes sense for those teams to be incentivized by sort of like owning the output of their work, right? I think like traditionally you see the sort of the central organization taking a really high take rate and saying like, hey, like 50% of your proceeds of all that revenue needs to go sort of go to the Dow treasury. And I think that's a flawed model. I think what you have to end up doing is letting the people that create and build out those products own the output of their work, right? So like KPI-based compensation or revenue splits or what have you, like let those teams, let those projects sort of reap the rewards of their own output, of their own labor. Yeah.
Looks like we're at time. So thank you all for joining. I think this was an awesome panel. The vibes were great. So if this were a DAO, this would be a great DAO. We've scaled it. And I will give the mic to Kristen now. Thanks, everyone.